Hi, welcome to Blue Collar Economics. I'm Dr. Brooks Mullen, and today we are going to talk about market systems, get a little bit into the basics of how a market system works and how economic systems work. Markets are anything that bring buyers and sellers together. Now, that could be a physical location or that could be a virtual location. It does not matter, but anywhere where we bring buyers, what we call demanders in economics, and sellers, what we call suppliers in economics together, is going to be called a market. A market is where exchange occurs, and as a result, prices are set and quantity sold occurs. We'll talk about the specific mechanics of that in a later video. But for now, just understand markets are where buyers and sellers come together. And the thing about markets is everything has a market. There's a market for goods. Goods are things that are tangible, things we can touch. And there's different kinds of goods. There's finished goods, goods that are ready for the end user. There's intermediary goods, goods that go into the processing of finished goods. And there's raw materials markets where we sell the actual raw components that get transformed into intermediary and finished goods. So as an example, a finished good is, like I'm filming on right now, a cell phone. And then an example of an intermediary good would be a camera, a graphics card, a touch screen, all of the subcomponents of the phone. And raw materials would be the silica and lead and nickel and cadmium and lithium and all the things that go into manufacturing the actual phone. So all of those physical things that we call goods have markets. And it's not just physical goods that have markets. Everything has a market. In a developed nation like the United States of America, the largest product markets are not actually goods markets. They're services markets. Services are intangible. They are a thing that someone performs for another person. Legal services, dental services, medical services, educational services. All of those make up a huge portion of the economy, oftentimes more of an economy than physical goods do. And it's not just goods and services that have markets. Everything has a market. All the resources that go into production have markets. So later on, we're going to talk about labor markets, the market where we actually sell our labor to earn a wage. And there is an argument that there is a marketplace for ideas where we propose various ideas and people supply new ideas and people demand new ideas. And depending on if those ideas get adopted, they become popular and widely consumed. Literally everything has a market. Now, when we talk about markets, there is a little bit more we've got to get into. If we're going to talk about markets, we need to talk about the role for government in markets. Now, right away, this is where if you are taking your understanding of economics from politics, you're going to have some issues with what we're going to talk about. But again, we're not here to talk about politics. We're here to talk about scientific theory as it relates to economics. So let's talk about that. When we talk about markets and government, there are four basic things that government has to do to make a market system work. If government doesn't do these things, market systems are suboptimal. They're inefficient. Now, this sounds like a lot. It is. Later videos, we're going to get more in depth on several of these subjects. We're going to drill down on exactly what they mean and how they affect things. This is just a little sample ahead of time. But off the jump, what a government has to do to make a market work is a government has to provide for private property rights. If you don't have the right to buy something, exchange cannot occur. If you don't have the right to sell something, exchange cannot occur. Can't buy something, can't sell something, can't have a market where buyers and sellers come together. So the government needs to create a system of private property rights and enforce that system of private property rights in order to have a market system work. If the government does not provide for private property rights, then no market activity can occur. Now, libertarians are almost always wrong. So now let's briefly talk about three things that the market fails at, that we need government to improve, that we need government to correct for in order to actually have economic efficiency. What the government has to do is deal with what happens when markets fail. We call these market failures. I know, real original term. But a market failure is when the market fails to properly allocate resources. And that can happen in two ways. That can happen because of market power, and that can happen because of externalities. Next thing on the list that the government has to correct for are what we call externalities. Externalities are costs and benefits that don't show up in the actual market. Now, this is jumping ahead a bit, but in short, a supply curve is the marginal cost curve. A demand curve is the marginal benefit curve. Now, that means that if there are benefits that aren't showing up in the marginal benefit curve, what we call positive externalities, we're under demanding and under producing as a market. If there are costs that don't show up in the marginal cost curve, those costs are leading us to oversupply and overproduce certain products. We call these positive and negative externalities. When there's positive externalities, we underproduce. When there's negative externalities, we overproduce. So one of the things we need government to do to make a market system as effective as possible is to correct for those externalities. There is what we call market power. We're going to spend multiple videos talking about market structure and how market power comes about. All you need to know for right now is that market power is what we also call monopoly power. If there's one seller of a product, that seller can artificially drive the price up by driving down production, meaning that we overprice and underproduce from what would be optimal. So one of the roles of government in dealing with markets is to correct for market power. We have things like antitrust laws to deal with this. Again, we'll spend a lot more time on that in future videos. When we talk about how an economy moves and how an economy behaves, we have to talk about the economic system. Now, broadly speaking, there are two kinds of economic systems. There are command systems and there are market systems. Now, these systems are going to answer two main questions. They're going to answer the question, who controls the factors of production? Who controls the actual inputs to producing goods and services? And they're going to answer, how do we motivate? How do we coordinate economic exchange? How do we promote progress? How do we actually say, well, these resources are going to get combined with those resources to make this product? How do we make that decision? Now, the market system and the command system could not be further apart on this. What do we mean by command systems? Well, a command system answers the two economic questions very simply. Number one, who owns the factors of production? Well, that's simple. The command entity, whatever that is. Typically, almost always, we're talking about a government. And then how do we coordinate economic activity? Well, in the command system, simple answer. However the command entity tells us to. So one of the oldest forms of government is also one of the oldest forms of a command system, and that is feudalism. Answers the questions very simply. Who owns the means of production? The king, the feudal lord, the daimyo, the warlord, the sheik, whatever your system called it, that person owned the land, and effectively that person owned the labor as well. And so, how did they answer the next question? How do we coordinate the economy? How do we dictate exchange of what will get made for whom? Easy. However the command entity says, whatever the king says. How do we decide what we trade? We trade what the king tells us to trade. How do we decide what we make? We make what the king tells us to make. Then we have market systems come along. We'll talk about that in a little bit. And later on, you get other forms of the command system. You get socialism. That's big S socialism. That's not anything that has to deal with social welfare. That's specifically where the majority of the factors of production are owned by the state. And then the most extreme form of that, you have communism, where all the means of production are controlled by the state. How do we decide what to coordinate? How do we decide what to make? We do whatever the command entity tells us, whatever the Politburo tells us, whatever Mao tells us, whatever Stalin tells us. Now, on the other side of the spectrum, we have the market system. The market system is different. Number one, under a market system, the factors of production are owned by the individual. Individuals own capital, that is physical goods used in production. Individuals own labor. Individuals own knowledge and skills. We call that human capital. But they're owned by the individual. And how do we coordinate that economic activity? We do so through markets. And we're going to spend a lot of time talking about the specifics of how that works. But ultimately, a market system involves individual, private ownership of the means of production. And one of the main means of production is capital. Again, capital is physical tools, etc., used in the production of goods and services. So another name for the market system is capitalism, taken from the private ownership of capital. In a market system, goods and services are supplied and resources are supplied to the production of goods and services by whoever is willing and able to do so. That's the thing about capitalism. It relies on the willingness and the ability of the individual to coordinate economic activity. Now, because capitalism involves all of these individuals acting together, it results in competition. For a market system to work optimally, for it to maximize utility in a society, the market system must have competition. Suppliers must compete with each other. Buyers must compete with each other. And in that competition, we will, and this will take some time, but we will illustrate it, result in optimal resource allocation, in total utility maximization. But again, that requires competition. See what we just said. One of the things that government has to do in a market is correct for when we have market power, correct for when there is a lack of competition. A lack of competition results in market systems producing suboptimally. Now, when we talk about capitalism, there's a lot to unpack. Market systems are complex and they have evolved over time. Originally, back when capitalist theory, when economic theory was new, we're talking Adam Smith publishes A Wealth of Nations in 1776, through classical economists like David Ricardo in the 1830s, up until, round about the 1890s, let's call it the 1890s. The number one prevailing idea of how a market system worked was what we called laissez-faire capitalism. It's literally French for, I think it's let it be or hands off. It gets translated a bunch of different ways. I don't speak French. Got a lot of skills in my life. Foreign language is not one of them. Can speak English pretty well. The rest of the languages I've tried to speak, I am terrible at. But nonetheless, you've heard the term laissez-faire before. Hands off, let it be. That means the government, according to laissez-faire capitalists, has no business regulating the economy. Everywhere the government gets involved, it creates a distortion. That distortion pushes away from optimal resource allocation. And this idea was prevalent for a long time, and it led to some horrible human rights crises. People like Thomas Malthus were laissez-faire capitalists. And Malthus argued that the British, while causing a famine in Ireland, which resulted in the genocide of the Irish people, there was no potato famine. their Irish grew more than enough food to feed everyone in Ireland. They were forced to export all that food to England, and the English let them starve when the potatoes blighted. Again, we're not a history channel, but just so you know, it's how a lot of our ancestors, including some of mine, got to the United States, was that these laissez-faire capitalists said, well, obviously, there's too many Irish people. We should let them die for the market to correct itself. Now, I am greatly paraphrasing a lot of books that were written at the time, but that's the gist of it. It's called Malthusianism. Thanos was a Malthusian. This idea that population growth would outstrip our ability to produce food, which would result in inevitable famines, which should result in large population die-offs. Population die-off is the economy self-correcting. So that's just one example. But laissez-faire capitalism resulted in a lot of problems. Now, we already talked about two of them. We talked about market power. We talked about when you get a lot of monopolies and what we call oligopolies, you have distortions of the market where the market starts overpricing and underproducing. Then you've also got externalities. You've got costs and benefits that aren't being captured by the market, so the market's not actually producing what's optimum for society. And in the age of laissez-faire capitalism, these problems ran rampant. And so then you started to see the rise of things like socialism and communism as a response to the failures of capitalism. Now, the solution, what has proved most optimal, is what we have today, what we call hybrid capitalism. Now, what hybrid capitalism is using the market system when it's the most efficient system, when it's the most effective system, and when it fails, using government to correct for that failure. So we start to introduce things like antitrust laws. We start to introduce things like taxes where we have pollution, like subsidies where we have underproduction, where there's a lot of positive externalities. Again, later video, we'll go over that in greater detail. But we started to develop systems that use some of the tools of command systems when those were more efficient and effective, and use the tools of the market system when they're not. And that's what most of the modern world is a hybrid capitalist system. So let me explain another little correction necessary for my American friends. Again, Europeans, I apologize that this has to be said, but there are no big S socialist countries in Europe. In Europe, yes, there are more socialist policies. There is national health care. Whole other thing we could get into about how national health care is more efficient than private health care. Don't have time for that. That'll come much later on in a different video. We'll get into the healthcare economics of that. But they do have that. They also, in Norway, nationalized their oil industry. The oil industry belongs to the government, and that's how they can fund all their high-quality social services in Norway. They do it with the profits from their national oil company. But in all of those countries, the majority of the factors of production are still owned by private citizens. The majority of economic activity is still coordinated through private markets. They are still capitalist systems. They are just hybrid capitalist systems. Much like in the United States, we have a hybrid capitalist system. We don't do it exactly the same, and none of the European countries do it the same. They've all got their own various differences amongst how they choose to organize their capitalist economies, but that's the reality. The market system is the most prevalent system. Now, a hybrid market system, yes, but the market system. A hybrid capitalist system utilizes government to promote certain goals within a market economy, goals that a laissez-faire economy doesn't promote. Things like economic stability. Without government intervention, now there's a lot of theory we could argue in a different class, in a macro class we could get into, but the idea is that government can be used to stabilize the economy, to reduce the fluctuations of this thing we call the business cycle, the growth and decay cycle of the economy. And people don't like instability. Instability makes life planning hard. Instability causes crisis and all these other things. Human beings like stability and predictability. And so one of the things we've learned to do is use governments to create greater degrees of economic stability. But that's not the only thing we promote. We use the government to promote economic growth. We use it to reallocate resources during recessionary periods in order to bring us back to economic growth. Another thing that we touched on is that there are externalities. There are things that are of benefit that the private market doesn't produce. So one of the things that we use hybrid capitalism for is to promote the production of goods that would otherwise be underproduced or not produced at all. Things like education, things like vaccines, things like, and you could argue, healthcare, are things that the government promotes the production of because private markets produce less than they would without government intervention. Or as again, in some cases, they would not produce the things at all. Finally, hybrid capitalist systems can be used to promote the redistribution of income. But there are arguments out there that unregulated market systems inevitably trend towards a very disproportionate distribution of income. One of the things you can do with a hybrid system is you can regulate the distribution of income. You can tax high income earners, give it to low income earners, and you can modify the distribution of income. There's a lot of ways that can be done. There's simpler ways that it can be done than we currently use. There are ways we do it now that are very complex and vary greatly from state to state and country to country. But overall, we do see, even in countries like the United States, which is fairly right-wing when it comes to economic policy, where we do some modification of income distribution. So again, there are goals that modern capitalist systems, modern hybrid economies promote that are outside of just whatever the free market wants. And so when we're talking about modern economic systems, we're usually going to be talking about hybrid economic systems, which are still, at the end of the day, market economic systems. So all the theory that we're going to produce going back to 1776 all the way up to modern day are going to be about market behavior and how markets produce prices and quantities and exchange. And if we can understand the behavior of those markets, then we can understand the behavior of literally everything that happens with economic exchange. So in the next video, we're going to dive deeper into that. We're going to talk about what the market system is, the types of questions the market system answers, and how the command system and the market system answered those questions differently, and why the market system ultimately won out. That'll do it for today, guys. I'm Dr. Brooks Mullen. This was Blue Collar Economics, and I'll see y'all next time.